What's good, everyone? G-Berg Stacks here, glad to be back. And while we're working towards anti-colonialism, let's talk about actualizer. This item is good. This item is, I don't think anybody has put the time to really learn or to understand what this text means. The only thing we see is percent damage increase, and you know, if it's big enough, it's good. But that's what we're here to do today. We're here to really speak about it, right? We're gonna read the text with y'all, and we're gonna really go through and understand, you know, what this really means. So, cheap item, decent, combining gold cost, good components, beautiful. Let's go to the stats, right? So 90 AP, decent, really good. 10 haste, that's not bad, right? But the thing that always really bothered me was the 300 mana, right? Especially for an item that makes you spend double the mana on every single cast. You know, it's kind of like, if there's ever a spot to buff this item, that's probably it, right? 300 more mana allows you to be, you know, a little bit more frequent without this item being activated, and then also when this item is being activated, right? Because a lot of champions, especially mages, the way that you push minion waves, you're using your abilities, right? Your abilities cost mana. If you're going into a fight half mana, no blue buff, or even with a blue buff, and then you pop actualizer, which doubles your mana cost, how many actual spells can you put out? All right, so let's go into the active, right? So the active is called Mana Made Real. So for 8 seconds, your mana is empowered. While empowered, your abilities cost 100 more mana. And then you gain a flat 15, so no matter what champion you are, unless you're a manaless champion, because you can't even use this active if you're a manaless champion, but you gain 15 plus 0.5% per 100 bonus mana. That means if you have something like, well, first of all, this, you gain an extra 1.5 just for having this item, right? So the base of this is 16.5. That's the base off rip, or you get 16.5 increased damage on your abilities. You get 15% increased ability damage. That's good. You get 15% increased healing, and you get 15% increased shielding, right? So obviously the ones that we're focusing on is mostly the ability damage, and your basic abilities cooldown progress 30% faster, and it has a 60-second cooldown. So the 60-second cooldown is very big. This means pretty much every other minion wave, you have a button that just makes you deal, if you have mana flow band and this is your only mana item, 18% increased damage. That is a lot, right? Imagine you're a champion whose entire combo does 1,000 damage, 18% more, just like that, as long as you hit your abilities, right? 180 more damage. Beautiful. Let's talk about this line of text, right? Your basic abilities cooldowns progress 30% faster. So for a while, I thought that this meant, right, let's say you had 20-second CD on Vigor Cage. I thought that it just dropped that 20-second to, by 30%, right? 30% of that would be 14 CD. I'm a left-handed user, right? But I have right hand on my mouse. But how it actually works is, you know, 20 seconds, right? Every second, it goes down by 1 second, your cooldowns. But what actualizer does is for the 8 seconds that it is active, we'll put 8S, it makes every second give you an extra 30% cooldown, right? So usually, right, we'll do real time for how the cooldown reduction works. It's -1 per 1 second. But with actualizer, we'll put 80 actualizer time. It is -1.3 per 1 second, right? So that 30% drops, or makes it so that every second counts for more cooldown reduction, right? And that is extremely powerful on champions that not only have low cooldowns, but it has synergy with things like transcendence, right? When you get a takedown, you lower your cooldowns on your basic abilities by a percentage, right? It works in tandem. So that's what this line of text means. For those 8 seconds, every second you're getting an extra 0.3 seconds off of your cooldown, right? So in total, after 8 seconds, you have an additional 2.4 CD. I'm bad with space. CD off of your cooldowns, right? So let's say your Aurora, right? Your Q is a 5-second cooldown. Every second, on that 5th second, you will have amassed an extra 1.5 seconds off of that thing, off of your cooldown, right? So that's very powerful when you are going against, right? Especially at the highest levels, right? People know and understand your cooldowns depending on your ability haste. I don't know if it's OD like that. Maybe specific players, right, know that, oh, if you're at 50 ability haste, usually this Syndra combo would take you another 10 seconds, but this person has an ability haste build, and so it's gonna take 7 seconds instead, right? And they understand that, and they can play around that. Actualizer flips that and says, I'm giving you extra haste every second that is going to mess up, you know, the accountability in the enemy player's head, right? At lower levels, this is not something you have to care about, right? Obviously, you're going to care about it when you get hit in the face earlier than you expect, but at the highest level where people are really thinking about that, this is going to mess them up. Another cool thing is with Actualizer is that you can use it while your abilities are on cooldown, right? So you can even mess them up like that. Let's say, you know, you just used your combo on Aurora, you missed, trash, right? And now they're like, ah ha ha, your cooldowns aren't up for another 5-7 seconds. You pop Actualizer while there's 2 seconds left, and after 2 seconds or after 1 second, your abilities are up 1.3 seconds faster, right? Or if you pop it while you're on 3 seconds, that means that they're up 1.6 faster, right? Obviously, you know, every second, blah 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 blah, right? It's a percentage of the second, right? I don't want to go OD, right? But just the many ways that you can use that. You don't have to use this when you are using your abilities. You feel me? Or as soon as your abilities are on cooldown, you can use it to really trick people, and that is a stronger thing to do at higher levels where people are accounting for these things. So let's talk about the items first, right? So Ludens Echo, it's an item that deals flat damage. It has a little bit of a percentage of your AP scaling, or it scales a little bit off of a percentage of your AP, right? But usually a single proc isn't doing more than, you know, maybe 200 damage throughout the entirety of the game, no matter how much AP you have, because people have magic resistance, and the damage gained from Ludens Echo is flat, right? So in the early game, it deals a lot of damage, right? It is a pretty good snowball item, but this is just really good for champions that, you know, can hit one ability from long range, and then you have the, I was gonna say audacity, but you have the ability to not necessarily engage with the enemy champion for 12 seconds, right? We're talking about Xerath, we're talking about Ziggs, we're talking about, Ziggs can kind of go a lot of stuff, but we're talking about even Vel'Koz to some extent, right? Some of these actual artillery mages, right? Ludens Echo isn't as useful on a lot of burst mages, because for a lot of these champions, in order to deal damage to the enemy champion, you're gonna be into their range, which means that, you know, getting something that just makes you deal more damage, or it's just not as useful because you're only gonna get one proc of Ludens Echo, right? Which isn't gonna give you as much damage. You can even say the same thing for some of these other ones, right? But the other one for burst is malignence. But a very big thing with malignence is that it lowers the enemy's magic resistance by a flat 10. That's amazing, especially if you're gonna go other pen items, right? You're gonna get Storm Surge, you're gonna get what's the other one, Shadow Flame. You're gonna get these items. That's beautiful, right? And usually a lot of these champions, or just how the game works, you're usually using your ultimate first, right? If you're talking about Aurora, if you're talking about LeBlanc, if you're talking about Fizz, right? And yeah, it makes sense. Especially because, you know, a lot of these champions start their combos off with their ultimate, which means getting that ultimate haste is very good. But a very big thing with malignence is that, you know, it's dodgeable. You can get out of the malignance zone, right? Because what lowers their magic resistance is the zone that procs under them when you hit them with magic damage specifically, or when you hit them with your ultimate. I think you have to apply magic damage. Now you just have to hit them with your ultimate, right? So you hit them with your ultimate, and you know, a big part of malignance isn't just, you know, the fact that you get the ultimate haste. It's the fact that you lower their magic resistance for a time while they're under that zone, which means that, you know, you want to burst them while they're there, but they can dodge it, right? It's you know, especially if they have a lot of dashes, which is very frequent in this game, right? It's dodgeable. But what's not dodgeable is actualizer, right? And that's kind of the big difference, right? For a lot of these champions, is that actualizer, as long as you hit your abilities, you're going to deal more damage. But for actualizer, there are mechanics, right? There's stuff if you can confirm the hit, you can pop actualizer, right? So that's kind of the thing, is that it allows you to save a little bit of mana, and I'll show you right now. So for actualizer, this is the mechanic that I'm talking about. If you know your E is going to land, right? Like here, I know my E is going to land, right? But before the damage pops off, I can pop my actualizer, and not only do I get the increased damage on the hit confirmed E, but I will then spend less mana on this ability, right? Same thing can happen with your Q and your R, right? This is very specific to specific champions, right? Let's say you know your E is going to land. You can pop your Q. You can even pop your R, right? You know your E is going to land, pop your Q, R, and then you press actualizer, and you just saved a ton of mana, right? We can, right? We can show the difference with this, right? You can press actualizer, E, Q, R, and look, I'm down 500 mana, right? This is very tough to do. You know, don't think that this is something easy. But you can EQR, then actualizer, and look, I'm only down 200 mana, right? So those are a couple of the mechanics you can do with this. I can promise you, I've been playing this build for a little bit, right? If you look at my recent match history, G-Berg stacks, at NA, you can see me mess up. You can see me not popping this. So I don't know if it's my mouse or something you also have to be wary about is that there's some champions, right, specifically Vel'Koz, where if you're channeling your ultimate and you want to use actualizer, if you press actualizer after you channeled your ultimate, you're gonna cancel your ultimate, right? And then there's also some champions like Aurora, where if you use your ultimate, let's go back into the practice tool, right? You're actually not allowed to press any other buttons during, you know, the cast time of your ultimate, which is not the same for a lot of champions, right? It's not like that for a lot of champions, but for whatever reason, you're locked out of using this item during Aurora's ultimate, which is not very good, right? And while we're here, we get to talk about some bugs. So as you can see, right, I have it on my mouse button, okay? This one right here to be, oh, look, as you can see, I'm pressing this button and you can see actualizer being popped, right? So I'm gonna press R and I'm gonna spam it. As you can see, I have not used the actualizer, right? So on her, it's a little bit different. You know, there's not too many mechanics that you can use here, right? Outside of not engaging with your ultimate, right? So on her, she is a little bit of a mana, you know, constraint, because you do get resets on your W, and while you have actualizer active, your W does cost a ton of mana, right? But that's beside the point. On her, it's kind of the same thing as Vex. If you know your Q is gonna hit, you can throw Q and then pop actualizer. Actually, During your E is the same thing as your ultimate. You can't pop actualizer until after, right? So if you know your Q is gonna hit or your E is gonna hit, you have to press it before it, right? This is just some of the things with this champion, right? You can W in if you know your Q is gonna your Q and E is gonna hit, right? You W in, toss Q, actualizer E, and then you know you do your thing, right? So here, I just want to show you know the cooldowns, right? So you can, like I said, Q, actualizer E, toss it back. You can see it's going down. I have actualizer active, right? Right, while this is active, you can press actualizer and you can see it's going down a little bit faster, just a little bit. It's that 0.3 that I was talking about, right? But those are some of the mechanics for actualizer, right? I just want to go over that. You have to understand your champion, know which abilities lock you out of active items, and you know, play around that. Okay, so there's a fire alarm going off. It wasn't my grandma. Something happened. We're in the projects. It is what it is, right? So a large part of a lot of champions damage is in the passive, right? This is, you know, this is like another ability, right? Another ability is worth of damage if you're able to do it, if you're able to hit it, right? But because for a lot of these champions it's counted as proc damage, actualizer doesn't give it increased damage, right? So imagine that your Vex, you get off. If you hit multiple targets, you can get off, depending on how many dashes they have, 5 to like 10, 15, I don't know, depending, right? It's a lot. Could be a lot, could be a little. But all of that is not getting increased damage. So you're losing damage because of the way things are coded, right? This is another thing that I think should probably be fixed. I do think it's kind of disgusting on some champions. Like, it also doesn't work on Aurora passive, right, which does percent max health damage. Yeah, right, it deals bonus magic damage equal to blah 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 of the target's maximum health, right? So eventually you can get up to like 20%, you know, max health damage with Aurora. If you get like 800, if you get 800, you do, yeah, around 20%, maybe even more than 20%, right? And imagine that getting increased by 18%, let's just say 20%, right? So now you'd be doing an extra 24, or you'd be doing an extra 4%, right? Which is, you know, very good. You're getting to that 25%. So 25% of someone's HP is just dealt through the passive, which can be procced off of basic attacks and abilities. Kind of disgusting, but, or like very, very strong, right? But it just doesn't work. Aurora's passive is a big part of her damage, right? And so that not getting increased by actualizer, it's pretty sad, right? Another champion on the list, well, Mel passive doesn't get increased, right? Her basic attack dealing extra magic damage, that doesn't get increased. Syndra W, because it comes from the passive, right, from her splinters, right, at 60, I believe. Where is it? Yeah, at 60 splinters of wrath, it will now deal, you know, a decent amount more true damage. That extra true damage that you end up getting does not get increased damage. It doesn't work with Vel'Koz's passive either, right? Every application of Vel'Koz's passive, right, it's kind of the same thing as Vex passive. So you hit someone 3 times, or it's different from Vex passive as that, but you hit someone 3 times with your spells, and then you get true damage, right? This is a very big portion of Vel'Koz's kit, but that doesn't get increased, right? But what does get increased is the ultimate. When it transforms into true damage, all of that true damage does actually get increased. On Diana and Silas, right, let's go with Silas, right? The passive on these champions, very big part of their burst, right? Because it's a lot of damage, right? But the primary damage on the person that you're hitting, right? So the person you're targeting with that, with your passive, right? With your basic attacks, that part doesn't get empowered, or it doesn't get increased, right, by actualizer. The nearby targets, right, the non-primary targets, right, the AoE damage does get increased by actualizer. It's very weird, but imagine you're Silas, you're hitting somebody with 8 passive procs that each deal like an extra 150 damage, right? You multiply that by 8, 1200 damage. You should be getting an increased, 20% from that, right? You should be getting an extra 240 damage from, the 8 total passive procs, but you don't get that much, which is, that's an extra ability you just missed out on just from your passive, right? This is what I'm trying to say. It's not, it's very unlucky, I would say, right? That's something that should be fixed. Okay, let's finally get into the champions that I think this item is probably their best item if they are going for a burst build, right? If they're going for finish the fight as quick as possible, hopefully in 8 seconds, or at least do their job in 8 seconds, and then do whatever they got to do next, right? Base TP, just go push a side lane, or do whatever, right? First, I want to talk about Ryze, Cassiopeia, and Nivea, because these are champions that, if you look at pro play, these are champions that frequently buy actualizer, right? So first I want to talk about Ryze, and obviously if you don't know Ryze's interaction with actualizer, because Ryze's passive gives him more bonus mana, or at least that's the way the game codes it, based on how much AP he builds, and then the fact that there's items that give him AP and mana, that's his standard build. He's not building some random stuff to end up, being stronger. He's building his normal build, right? It makes actualizer completely outlandish on this champion, right? The normal threshold that most champions get for actualizer is at most 25% increase on damage, healing, and shielding. A Ryze gets 50 up to 60%, which is, it's ridiculous, right? While also reaching super high levels of AP and going a good build, right? So it's just too broken on him. Needs to be fixed, right? Cassiopeia, it's a really good burst item on Cassiopeia because she has very low cooldowns, right? The fact that your spells progress 30% faster, and on a champion that has her main spell be less than 1 second in order to continuously cast it, it can be super strong on a Nivea. I do think there are times where you can forego the Roa, right, and kind of go more bursty, right? But there's not too many burst items on Cassiopeia. Did I say a Nivea before? While talking about Cassiopeia, my bad. If I did. If I didn't, let's keep going. But, right, the one thing I do think Cassiopeia has over pretty much every other champion is the fact that she has healing in her kit while dealing damage. So actualizer serves 2 purposes, right? We talked about how Roig does get increased healing, right? So Cassiopeia, all her healing from Roa, from her Twin Fangs, right? From the poison healing passive, whatever that she has on her Twin Fangs, all of that gets increased, making her that much more of a drain tank, right? And if we're looking at the new season, since we're learning about it today, there are Omnivamp boots coming out, which means that now there's even more healing in the game, right? So you can end up making actualizer for Cassiopeia be kind of like a drain tank item, right? For those 8 seconds, you have a ton of increased healing, right? And so any champion that's kind of looking to one-shot you, that can't like CC you for the duration of your one-shot, right? Champions like Lux, where, if you get hit by a binding, you're going to probably die. As opposed to a champion like Diana, where she's going to CC you, but it's just a knock-up for like maybe half a second, maybe a quarter of a second. During that time, you're going to be able to deal or pull off a lot of spells, meaning that you're going to be healing, right? And then the only thing left that she has is her consistent damage. And so her consistent damage versus your healing, maybe, depending on the numbers, depending where we're at, right, you can win that as Cassiopeia drain tanking her, right? It goes for other champions and things like that, right? So that is one of the ways that I do believe Cassiopeia is really good with with actualizer, right? And then the last one is Anivia, where they build it sometimes with the same build, right? Roa Seraphs. It's not bad. Her E is on a very short cooldown. So, 2-3 more E's while the enemy champion is, taking 100 or 50% increased damage from it because your R is so low cooldown. It's really good. But, it's cool. Maybe you get an extra Q off. You don't deal too much damage, right? It does increase your ult damage. But right now, like Anivia, she's not necessarily the biggest burst champion, right? That's kind of mostly what she has, but she's more just, right, like keeping people in the zone. And then Malignance kind of does the same thing, right? Especially if the enemy team doesn't have too much magic resistance, right? The 10 magic resistance reduction can be counted towards as more, right? It just kind of like, and then it just kind of helps with her ultimate, right? It's kind of the same thing of what I'm thinking about with Ahri, right? What matters more? The increased damage that you get from Actualizer or the increased damage that you get from Malignance, plus the reduction in cooldown, plus it gives you kind of a little bit like of a support aspect, right? If you have any other magic damage dealers on your team, the fact that you're lowering an enemy champion's magic resistance by 10 can be pretty good for those other champions, right? The Gwens, the Cho'Gaths, the Silences, the Dianas, and things like that, right? So it kind of depends. And right now, like, Anivia is kind of so strong where it kind of doesn't matter, right? But let's get into the other ones that should probably go this, right? So I have 3 categories. I'm going to start with the Sheen maybe belt because it's kind of simple, right? So a lot of these champions, I want to talk about Gragas and Cho'Gath first, right? When you're playing these champions in lane, right, specifically top or mid, getting a Lost Chapter is kind of important, especially for Gragas, right? Gragas, you need some type of mana to combat a lot of champions, right? Because the only way you can really kite champions, the only way you can really continuously whittle down enemy champions, especially in the top lane, is if you have mana, right? So you need that Lost Chapter, right? You don't necessarily need to upgrade it first. There's a lot of other items that can really help you at achieving that annoying job that Gragas does if you're really good, right? When you look at challenger players play Gragas versus melee matchups or specific champions, you can see them really whittle people down and use items, right? Such as Rocket Belt can be really strong for Gragas, right? Just to get into range or get out of range in certain matchups, right? And so what are you going to do with that Lost Chapter? The best thing that you can do is turn it into an actualizer, because Gragas is a champion that you do kind of go a lot of AP. Going full AP, Gragas is a good thing. And so all that AP, he does a lot of damage, right? There's ways to, deal as much damage, the bomba play, where you let the barrel cook, right? And there's a lot of ways to really use actualizer on this champion. It's pretty cool. It's really fun. I think it's super strong to upgrade that Lost Chapter, because I don't know if you've seen the boss, but usually he would buy Lost Chapter. At the end of the game, he would sell it for a different item. But now you can just upgrade it into actualizer. And actualizer is kind of, especially the later, you go into the game, is actually a really strong item compared to a lot of other items, right? The more damage you have, the more AP you have, the stronger actualizer is actually on you, right? And then the more levels. But yeah, same thing goes for Cho'Gath. You buy that Lost Chapter. You probably get Rocket Belt. You don't need too much Lost Chapter on Cho'Gath. There's maybe specific matchups, but if you're going that, the Rocket Belt, the Rift Maker, right, you don't necessarily have to go full AP, but Actualizer increases all, true damage as well, and so it just adds to your burst. Your ultimate ends up maybe doing 900, 1000 damage. So imagine it doing 20% more damage or 18% more damage, right? We're talking about an extra 180, 200 damage. Can be very, very strong, right? Just for your burst versus an enemy squishy. And then we have Diana, Silas, and Fizz. So these champions, they're not necessarily terrible at wave clear, but maybe the mana helps, right? Maybe a Lost Chapter item helps, but specifically the fact that they have a ton of damage, right? And they want to deal that damage as fast as possible, and their survivability kind of weighs in on their cooldowns, right? And so you get best of the both worlds. You get the increased damage, probably one of the strongest one item spike items. It's kind of better the later the game goes, but depending on how many levels you have, blah, blah, blah. I already talked about this, right? But the fact that it lowers your cooldowns as well as giving you a ton of damage, and like it's just the best for both of these if you're going full burst, right? You can end up getting Rocket Belt on all three of these champions. You can end up getting Sheen on all three of these champions, right? If not Dusk and Dawn for Diana, then definitely Lichbane for the three of them. Obviously, getting a Zhonya's is amazing on all three of these champions as well, right? We talked about Zhonya's. The fact that during stasis, your cooldowns continuously go down, leading you to having even more access to your abilities, right? During the actualizer passive. And maybe getting another set off before you die or before the fight's finished, right? And so, in my opinion, I'm going to be testing it, but I do think it's pretty good, right? And then we have the double mana haste champions. It doesn't necessarily have to be haste, but I just want to kind of put it out there, right? So, for these champions, Orianna and Veigar, they use a lot of mana, right? In order to deal as much damage as they want, they're going to be using a lot of their mana, and then because they have utility in their kit, you want to be using your utility kind of as much as possible. And so, you're going to need the mana, you're going to need the tier, right? If you build Actualizer, you should be building Actualizer, just because it gives you the most damage that you can have, right? And then the tier becomes Seraph's Embrace. It also gives you access to kind of a cheaper build, right? You don't have to go for the Shadow Flame. You can sit on the tier. Instead of getting Shadow Flame for the flat magic pen and for the high AP, you can go something like a Crypt Bloom, which gives you, some percentage magic penetration, but mostly it gives you that ability haste, right? And so now you're going for more of an ability haste type of synergy with Actualizer and going for more like damage over time, essentially, right? You do still get obviously higher burst because these champions do have big burst with their ultimates, with their their combos, right? Their QW into R, but then after that, their next Q, their next W are also still gonna deal more damage, and they're gonna be up quicker, right? So you can get these items, you can get, I'm pretty sure like Crypt Bloom might be one of the only ability haste items you might want. I forgot. I talked about maybe another one, but I forgot, right? Seraph's Embrace is going to give you, right? And then you can end up getting, instead of going the First Strike build, you go, maybe in the new season, you go Deathfire's Touch, or you go Arcane Comet still, right? And during that, you're going to be dealing, pretty monumental damage over time and stuff like that, right? Which also gives you access to Transcendence. And then your secondary tree, because you don't need as much gold, right? You don't necessarily need cashback. You can go into the precision tree and get the basic ability haste from the precision tree, whichever one that one's called, I forgot. And then you can also get increased damage with the cut down and stuff like that, right? So that's kind of what I'm thinking with these two champions. And then we go to the full pen champions, right? So one champion that wasn't here before was the Fiddlesticks, right? But mostly for champions like Vex, Aurora, Mel, Syndra, LeBlanc, and Fiddlesticks, even all of these champions, right? Their first item, Actualizer. It's super strong on these champions. Some of these champions do have true damage, which, it doesn't get increased for, Syndra. And like a lot of their passives don't get increased. But if that gets fixed, just know it's that much stronger. It's a lot stronger, to be honest. But the second item, right? So pretty much every other champion besides Vel'Koz kind of has two options, maybe three, right? You have, for everyone besides LeBlanc, you have the option of Shadow Flame, or you have the option of Zonias, right? Whichever one's gonna help you more, whichever one's gonna help you deal more damage is going to be better, right? Some of these champions kind of do need Shadow Flame in order to really like clear minion waves efficiently and save more mana so that you're ready for fights, right? Specifically Aurora, but she is different from Vex, from Mel, from Syndra, from even Fiddlesticks, because she has a little bit more survivability due to her having access to dashes in her W, and like just kind of a lot of move speed, and even in her ultimate if used in specific ways, right? So her survivability isn't really tied to it's less tied to an item than some of these other champions, right? But LeBlanc also has access to Lichbane. It's a pretty good burst item on her. It gives her everything she wants, right? So that's the only minor difference. And then Vel'Koz also has access to Horizon Focus, which is just cheaper, right? It doesn't give as much AP, but what it does give is 10% increased damage on all your abilities. And so because you have true damage, it's a good way to increase your true damage. And so it allows you to you know, go a little bit cheaper while also getting haste, which is pretty decent on Vel'Koz. And so you can get, you know, like a really strong other item that's a little bit cheaper, right? Instead of just going Shadow Flame. Depending if the haste is going to help you more, I have to do some testing, right? I have to play a couple games. But besides that, Fiddlesticks, right? You can go Shadow Flame. You can go, what's it called? Zonias. Fiddle in the middle has been pretty good. But yeah, these are some champions I'm going to be testing. Okay, now if we go to items, there's obviously a few that are going to be better, right? When we're talking about burst mages, you're looking at the burst items, right? You're looking at flat pen items, flat magic penetration items. You're looking at item damage. You're looking at high AP. Right, so after Actualizer, a lot of the times the best item to go is Shadow Flame. It just gives some of the highest AP. You know, it gives flat magic penetration, and then it gives you the 20% increased damage when enemies are below 40% health. And because your combo is going to deal close to 100%, that final attack is going to deal increased, which can put you over the edge, but it's one of the best. You know, Shadow Flame has really good synergy with Actualizer, just making you deal that much more damage, right? Storm Surge is kind of the same. Storm Surge actually gets increased damage from Actualizer, right? The passive, the Storm Rate, or the Squall passive actually deals more damage if you proc it during the activation of Actualizer. Kind of funny, right? I do think items like Lichbane are pretty strong with Actualizer. Unfortunately, the Spell Blade proc does not get increased damage during the Actualizer passive activation, right? But the 100 ability power, the fact that it's 2,900 is really good. The move speed is obviously move speed, that's fine. But then the fact that it gives you ability haste is, you know, that much better, right? Any subtle amount of ability haste you can get without sacrificing damage is just amazing, right? That's why blue buff is pretty important. They got rid of a lot of added like ability haste to some champions, right? But or to some items, right? Like Staff of Flowing Water used to give ability haste. That would have been really good, but they got rid of that. Items like Gunblade to some extent can be the active. The Lightning Bolt does get increased damage similar to the Squall passive, right? For whatever reason, these type of actives does give increased damage. Proto Belt surprisingly can be very good, right? The stats are very good. For bruisery champions, I think it's really good. One big thing that can happen is you might end up running into the problem of having 3 active items, right? You could have Proto Belt or Rocket Belt. You could have Actualizer, and then you could end up having something like Zonias. And so now you have 3 actives. If you're not good with a lot of actives, you know, maybe you want to stay away from it, or it's something you're going to have to practice. But I think Proto Belt is good. 70 ability power, obviously not the best, right? But the ability haste is really big. The health is really big because of the ability haste, right? And because it works in the way where, you know, your cooldowns are progressing faster. And so if the health and the ability haste allows you to get to that next set of cooldowns during that 8 seconds, and then allows you to get to maybe an extra set of cooldowns during the activation of Actualizer, it's going to just make you profit that much more, right? Where Zhonya's is amazing, right? Because your cooldowns don't stop progressing while you are in stasis, right? Zhonya's does give a good amount of ability power, and then obviously the stasis is super good for burst mages, right? Because it allows you to go in, use your burst, and then try your best to dodge as many of the enemy abilities with your stasis, right? And then it also helps you wait for your cooldowns, which are coming out, which are progressing quicker. And so during the Zonya stasis, you are actually getting an extra 0.75 seconds off of your cooldowns because you're in stasis for 2.5 seconds, right? Which is that's decent, right? That can be the difference in some cases. Void Staff is probably the best like percentage penetration item you can get. It's maybe a little different with Crit Bloom, right? Maybe the 20 haste, depending on your build, can end up being meaningful, right? To squeeze out an extra like combo, an extra spell, an extra 2 spells during actualizer because of the ability haste that Crit Bloom gives you. But the 20 AP, the 10% magic penetration that you get, the difference between Void Staff and Crit Bloom can also be a very big difference, right? So it really just depends if you know your numbers. I want to do some testing with this. There's probably some champions that it's meaningful on, right? Maybe like Vigar, champions that get really high AP for free, or champions that kind of have already very low cooldowns, right? Oh, yeah. I'm thinking the same thing kind of for Bloodletter's Curse, right? But the one thing about Bloodletter's Curse is the fact that you obviously need to deal 6 instances, or 4 instances of magic damage before you get the maximum amount of magic penetration. But besides that, right, 65 ability power. This is kind of essentially Rocket Belt, right? In terms of stats, but it gives you the % magic penetration. I think that's good. And then obviously Death Cap. You need Death Cap in your build. If you do not get a 3rd item, you must get a 4th item, right? The only item that you can probably say might give you more than Death Cap can be something like a Void Staff, right? If you needed to get a Zhonya's as your 2nd item, right? Shadow Flame is really good for a lot of champions because it helps with wave clear astronomically, right? That is kind of the big difference between Shadow Flame and a lot of other items, is that Shadow Flame helps with those little tiny teeny spots where minions live with 1 HP or like 10 HP, right? And it just conserves you mana because it deals a lot more damage to minions, right? And so that's one more thing you gotta think about, right? And then finally, Riftmaker. Riftmaker is also very strong. It's the same thing as Rocket Belt, aside from the fact that Actualizer giving you more access to your abilities means you're going to be using, this Omnivamp more. You're going to be gaining a lot more from this 8% damage increase, right? Stuff like that. Another item, the last item I want to talk about is Horizon Focus. This can be good specifically on champions like Vagar. No, not Vagar. Like Vel'Koz, because you get the haste, which is good, but mostly the 10% increased damage on your abilities, right? Since Vel'Koz is a champion that does do true damage, Horizon Focus can be one of the better ones, right? But you also gotta think, like, depending on your champion, because you have such low mana, due to not having as much mana, because Actualizer doesn't give as much mana as the other Lost Chapter items. You got to be wary of how much haste you have, because spamming too many abilities can be very bad. There is one thing you can do in the game, which is you can buy a tier and then sit on it, right? This is very important for champions like Vagar, for Orianna, because eventually your mana costs do get too high, and you might need to end up needing extra mana, right? And it just helps you out throughout the game so you can continuously play your champion, right? For champions that do need tier, right, eventually you can end up upgrading to archangels. It's not bad, right? It gives you the haste, which is amazing. It ends up being a relatively high AP item. Actualizer only gives you 6 more ability power with the passive of Archangel Staff or of Seraph's Embrace, right? But aside from that, it's pretty decent. It does, if for whatever reason you use Actualizer while you're relatively low HP, or if your Seraph's Embrace shield pops, it does get benefited by Actualizer, which is pretty decent, right? Get a little bit more shield. It does work with Roa, right? Every mana you spend during the passive of Actualizer gains however much increased healing from the Actualizer passive onto the Roa passive, right? So if you were healing by 50 whatever every cast, Actualizer gave you, let's just say, 25% more increased healing. Your Rod of Ages will then end up healing you for 62, right? Maybe 63, depending if Riot rounds up or down. But there's probably some other items that works on, but you know, you're not gonna get any other items other than probably AP items. I am kind of thinking maybe some champions that dip in, maybe some AP champions, right? Some AP enchanters that dip into items like a Diadem of Songs or Echoes of Helia. Maybe Actualizer is good, but I do think it's more of a burst item. It's not necessarily an item you want to mix with healing and shield power. It's decent, but the fact that this only lasts for 8 seconds, as a healer and shielder, your job is to make fights last a lot longer than, you know, they're supposed to, right? So it's kind of anti-burst, but you're building a burst item to make your anti-burst better. Kind of weird. Maybe on Seraphine it can be good because she just naturally does a lot of damage, and then you kind of want your spells up as long as possible, but I don't know. Okay, so I'm on the PBE right now, and it's a good thing that I took my time with making this portion of the video, or wanting to kind of redo it, right? I want to talk about the items and the keystones, which, or just the runes in general, which synergize with Actualizer. So before, as of currently in the patch, right before the new season rolls out, Arcane Comet has an effect where every ability that you hit an enemy champion with lowers the cooldown of Arcane Comet. And that synergizes with Actualizer because Actualizer gives you 30% cooldown increase, or cooldown reduction, I guess, whatever you want to call it. We went over it earlier. And so this means the more cooldowns you throw out, the more Arcane Comets you're going to have. If during that 8 seconds of the Actualizer active, you get to throw out an extra Arcane Comet, not only is that synergy, but that's more damage, and you know, that's really good, right? And if you're a champion like Veigar Cassio or something like that, which throws out a whole bunch of abilities, right, it's going to mean that much more to have Arcane Comet because you're going to deal that much more damage, right? Maybe 2, maybe 3 extra Arcane Comets can be pretty beneficial, right? But they changed Arcane Comet. Now it doesn't have that cooldown reduction. It's just a very big, you know, it gets damage amplification based on range. Pretty cool change, but negative change for, you know, synergy with Actualizer. Deathfire Touch doesn't have necessarily anything, you know, really good with Actualizer. There's no synergy, right? There are some champions that I will go over which probably will take Deathfire Touch over anything else, even if they do build Actualizer, but regardless, we lost a keystone for that. But Sorcery Tree is still one of the only other trees that you're going to take, in my opinion, if you're going for a full burst build and you're going to be buying Actualizer, right? Because you need mana flow ban. Not only does it give you more increased damage, it's not too much, but it's increased damage, but it also gives you that flat mana, which you really are going to need since Actualizer only gives you 300 mana. Right? Transcendence, we talked about it earlier. Not only is the ability haste really good in combination with Actualizer, but the fact that at level 11, when you get a champion takedown, if you get a champion takedown, you'll reduce the remaining cooldown of your basic abilities by 20%. That is huge to, work in tandem with Actualizer. Gathering Storm is another good one, but it was only good if you. It's good. It's the better one. It's better than Scorch if you take it as your if you take Sorcery Tree as your primary tree. But obviously, because the more AP you have, this means the more damage from your abilities, which means it gets increased by Actualizer, right? Every AP giving you more damage, it's gonna be increased even more through Actualizer, right? So it's kind of overall just the better one. Even at 10 minutes, that's probably when you're gonna get your Actualizer. A little bit more AP. It's not like, whoa, super cool, but eventually it will be better than Scorch, and you're kind of playing for those times, right? The 10, 20 minutes, whatever. It's just, in my opinion, probably a little bit better. And we're only talking about Actualizer. If we're talking about the real game, maybe Scorch is better. Who cares? But this is the actual keystone, which synergizes with, or it's going to be the only keystone that really has some type of synergy with Actualizer come in the new season, right? It's going to be First Strike. So how First Strike works, not only does it grant you gold, but it gives you 7%. I think it's, it gives you 7% extra damage against champions, right, when it's procced. And that's based on all the damage you deal. So if you proc Actualizer, when you deal the damage, not only does Actualizer increase the damage of your abilities, but then you're going to deal an extra 7% from all that damage you did with your items, with whatever, to the enemy champion by 7%, and it will be dealt as true damage, right? And then, because Actualizer gave you more damage, right, that means you actually get more gold from First Strike than, a different champion would, or from an item, a different item used by the same champion, right? So, not only does it work like that, but because you're going to be building, right, a lot of the more expensive items, you need Death Cap. Death Cap is one of the best items for Actualizer because you need to deal as much damage as possible, right? As a burst mage, you need burst, and the biggest burst item is Death Cap after 2 items, just because it gives you the amount of AP that any other item in the game will. Or it gives you as much, if not more AP than any other item in the game would. And that scaling is just too monumental, right? And so you use the gold from First Strike to, afford these higher cost items, right? You get cash back, same premise. You get more gold. You get to your stronger or your heavier items faster, right? Same thing with Triple Tonic. And also, because Actualizer scales off of the damage dealt by your abilities, right? Every base level or every point into your abilities is just more damage to Actualizer. And it's even, earlier, right? At level 9, level 10, level 11, you're going to have your Actualizer. And so every point makes your burst, that much stronger. And then you can get Jack of all trades. You're not going to get the 25 adaptive force by getting 10 stacks. You're only going to get the 10. It's not bad, but it gives you more damage early, and that's kind of what you want, right? Cosmic Insight can obviously be good. Approach Velocity can be really good too. It just kind of depends, right, on what you're looking at, right? So this is kind of the normal rune page that you will see, and then these kind of depend, right? I don't think they matter too much. You can go like for a very lane oriented build, right? Same thing can kind of happen with stuff like Jack of all trades or, right, Approach Velocity. But Mana Flow Band, Transcendence, First Strike, Cashback, Triple Tonic, those are pretty much the essential ones that you're probably never going to change. Thank you for staying with me for this very long video. Appreciate it. Hope y'all liked it, right? I cut this up, try to make it as watchable as possible. I hope y'all are good. I hope I know not everything's good, right? But what we need is to work not only on ourselves, but work in our communities, right? Because we got to stop thinking individualistically. We got to start thinking more of our community, right? Because I am you, you are me, we are we. Something like that. But yeah. Love y'all. have a great day. I'll be coming out with more videos, gameplay videos, talking about actualizer, and then some other videos kind of like this. Peace. Love you.